Hello and welcome to this presentation of the trials of Jesus. And as you can see in front of me, I have the portrait of what's called Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. Pilate presenting Jesus to the crowds. During this Holy Week, I would ask you to consider what seems to be a prevailing view, the arrest and trials of Jesus, that even though Jewish law was enlightened for its time, there were probably no safeguards in its rules and procedures to protect the rights of an accused like Jesus, such as in our American Constitution and our Bill of Rights. But I've found that the opposite is true. In so many ways, Jewish law went far beyond American law in protecting the rights of an accused. They were just ignored in the case of Jesus. Let me give you a few examples. And as I do, consider whether these laws were applied or ignored in the case of Jesus. First, under Jewish law, the laws applied equally to whether you were a Jew or a foreigner alike. This may not seem remarkable to you, but remember, even Rome discriminated against non-citizens. And we see that in the case of Paul. Paul was able to escape a beating in Acts by saying, I'm a citizen of Rome, unlike these other people, and I'm entitled to due process. Paul was able to be executed, unlike Peter, not by crucifixion, but by beheading, which was considered more humane. Now, you might think, what's the big deal about equal rights for citizens and non-citizens? Well, in this country, we didn't have that right until the 14th Amendment. That was in 1868, just after the 13th Amendment, which gave freedom to everyone, to slaves. The 14th Amendment said all people are entitled to equal access under the law and due process. But that wasn't until 1868. It was the law back then for the Jews. Next, under Jewish law, you had a right to engage a lawyer or have a court appoint one for you in a case where you were accused of a crime. And again, we might say, what's the big deal about that? We do that in this country. Well, we only did it as of 1965 in the famous case of Gideon versus Wainwright in the Supreme Court. 1965. But before that, in this country, you were not entitled to have a lawyer. Now, I would ask you, did Jesus have a lawyer representing him? Next, under Jewish law, there could be no conviction of a criminal crime, of a capital crime, without testimony of two witnesses to the act. And those witnesses must agree with each other. Now imagine that in this country. If we said that for any crime where you could be imprisoned for the rest of your life or if you were submitted to capital punishment, that you had to have two people who actually saw you do what you did. How rare would it be that we would ever have a conviction for that? And yet, under Jewish law, they required that. Two people had to see what you did for you to be convicted of a capital crime. They wanted it to be rare. They didn't want people to be easily subjected to the law. That's just how different they were from us today. And imagine if you were to commit a crime, how you would try to avoid having anybody see what you did. And that's usually the way it is. But they required 2 witnesses, and they had to agree with each other. Now ask yourselves, in the trial of Jesus, were there 2 witnesses? Yes. Did they agree with each other about what they said Jesus had said to them? No. Next, under Jewish law, an accused could not be compelled to be a witness against himself, which is what we say in our Fifth Amendment. And here's something further. Even voluntary confessions were insufficient to convict a person. You still needed 2 witnesses. Okay, yes, we have a Fifth Amendment, just like they did, essentially. You could not be compelled to give evidence against yourself. Was Jesus compelled to do that before the Sanhedrin? Yes. But also, they didn't even allow a person to voluntarily give evidence against himself. It's hard to imagine a criminal justice system in our country or any country where we don't accept confessions. We encourage people to confess. But under Jewish law, they would not allow a voluntary confession to be used against you. And why? Because they thought it would encourage the state to coerce it, to beat it out of you. And so they said, we're taking that liberty away from the state. We're not going to allow a confession at all in evidence. Under Jewish law, circumstantial evidence was not admissible at all. Again, they wanted direct evidence from 2 witnesses. And so we might ask, how often is circumstantial evidence used against defendants in criminal cases today? The answer is all the time. That's usually all we have, because we don't have people who saw you do it. What we do have is circumstantial evidence. Here's an example. A witness says, well, I didn't see him shoot his wife, but the day before she was shot, I saw him cleaning his gun, and he was telling me how much happier he would be if his wife were dead. That's circumstantial evidence. That's enough evidence to put you into the gas chamber in this country. In the time of Jesus, that would not have been allowed into evidence. Under Jewish law, an accused was presumed innocent until proven guilty. That should sound very familiar to us. You are assumed to be innocent and not guilty until proven guilty. Now, we got that in this country from England. Where did England get it? From Israel. It goes that far back. Under Jewish law, trials had to be conducted in public, and no evidence could be presented outside of the presence of the accused. Also, arrests had to occur only in the daytime. You could not arrest anyone at night. When was Jesus arrested? And also, the trials had to occur in the daytime. When was Jesus tried for the first time in front of the Sanhedrin? It was at night. Under Jewish law, witnesses who lied were subjected to the same penalty for which the accused would be sentenced if convicted. What that meant was they took perjury seriously. If you lied under oath about somebody else, you would be subjected to the same penalty that person would have been tried for. In the case of Jesus, that would have been death. And we see this in the book of Acts, where James, the brother of John, the disciple James, was convicted by Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin of being a Jewish heretic. In other words, being a Christian. And he admitted it. And so he was sent to be beheaded. And the man who testified against him, when seeing just how blithely James went to the chopping block, he had a change of heart. And he told Caiaphas, I recant. I'm sorry. I didn't mean what I said in my testimony. I take it back. I didn't see or hear him do anything. And Caiaphas said, then you lied. Get in line. You're next. And he was beheaded after James. So they took perjury seriously. In our country today, when was the last time you ever heard of anyone being convicted of perjury? It rarely happens, and yet every day in every courtroom in this country, people lie under oath. Also, under Jewish law, any indignities that were inflicted on an accused, such as insults or physical abuse, resulted in the inflictor receiving the same sentence that had been imposed upon the accused. Think about how Jesus was beaten and verbally abused the entire evening of his arrest and his trials. Was anything done to those people? Under Jewish law, no capital case could be tried at night or on the Sabbath or on a feast day. Remember, when was Jesus tried? It was on the weekend of the Passover. Nor could any sentence be executed on the Sabbath or feast days. And then finally, as a general philosophy, it was clearly understood that the function of the court was to preserve human life and not take it away. Therefore, the judges were to be completely impartial and objective, and all presumptions were in the favor of the accused. And in fact, at the end of the trial, the judges would ask the witnesses, is there anything good that you can say about this person that we might need to hear? Under our system of justice, we would never do that. We never allow people to make speeches in a courtroom. You only answer questions as a witness. And so often, witnesses will say, I wanted to say more. There was so much I wanted to say that the jury needed to hear, but I wasn't asked the question. Yeah, that's what happens under our system of justice. And remember, who was the prosecutor for the Sanhedrin against Jesus? It was Caiaphas. And we see in John's gospel, before Jesus was arrested, Caiaphas said, This person needs to be executed. For the sake of the nation, Jesus must die. Is that objective and impartial? Of course not. Okay, very quickly. Under Jewish law, there were 3 levels of courts, depending upon where you lived. If you lived in a small town, you would have a court of 3, and that would have been the lowest court. Very informal, kind of like umpires that were chosen by the parties. And this would be in villages of 100 people or less. And then, in a larger town, you'd have a minor Sanhedrin. And they would have existed in places where there were more than 100 people. And these members would have been appointed by the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And if you had an appeal, it would go from there directly to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And then finally, you had their Supreme Court, the great Sanhedrin. And it was composed of 2 presiding officers, then 23 priests, 23 scribes, who were lawyers, and 23 elders. And remember Jesus' prediction that he would suffer many things of the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and he would be killed. He said this to his disciples after the transfiguration. He was talking about the great Sanhedrin, who would eventually try him. Now, what rules did we have with the great Sanhedrin? First, they could only operate in the temple in Jerusalem. It would have been illegal for them to meet anywhere else. And this would be the version of a Jewish sunshine law. Now, where was Jesus initially tried? In the house of Caiaphas. And when? It was not in the sunshine. It was at night. Also, the Sanhedrin members could not be prosecutors or accusers. It was their sole duty to determine the guilt or innocence based on the law and the evidence that was presented. And they had to be completely fair and impartial. Well, Caiaphas had already said, I want him dead. And he was the prosecutor, and he was the one who led the Sanhedrin against Jesus. Now, upon a vote of conviction, the Sanhedrin had to recess and reconvene in 3 days to determine the sentence, but only after they'd taken another vote to see if anyone changed their minds. What this means is, as a jury of 70 plus people, once they had convicted someone, they had to go away, wait, cool off for 3 days, and then come back and vote again to see if anyone had changed their minds. How long did they wait for Jesus after they had convicted him? 3 days or 3 hours? And then finally, a unanimous vote of guilty would have been considered an acquittal under Jewish law. Now, see, in our country, we require a unanimous vote for guilt. But under Jewish law, if all 70 plus people say he's guilty, the assumption would have been there's collusion. There's something fishy about this. Okay? And you would have been acquitted if there had been a unanimous vote of guilty. Jesus was convicted with a unanimous vote. But I think it shows just how more in touch people were back then, these Jews were back then, with human nature. We require a jury to be unanimous. Well, having sat on a couple of juries and having been a lawyer speaking to juries, I know that so often people just, against their will, give in just to get out of that jury room. They say, okay, fine, he's guilty. I don't think he is, but I'll agree to it because I want to go home. That happens every day in every courtroom in America. Under Jewish law, they said, that's wrong. That's wrong. People will disagree. We understand that. It's just a unanimous verdict of guilt that will convict you. Now, as for Roman law, at the time of Jesus, judicial authority was vested in officials called praetors. That is what Pilate was, although his official title was imperial procurator of Judea. Pilate was married to Claudia, the daughter of Julia, who was the granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. And Pilate had jurisdiction over Jewish capital cases at Jerusalem, which were crimes under Roman law. But his authority in such cases was not merely to approve or disapprove the verdict and the sentence of the Jewish court. He also had to hear the testimony of witnesses and make an independent determination of whether the accused was guilty under Roman law. And that's what we would call, in Latin terms, a trial de novo, a new trial. In other words, the accused got another trial under Pilate. If the crime charged was not recognized under Roman law, for example, when the Jews said to Pilate that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy, Pilate said that's not a crime under our law. Then Pilate would let the Jewish courts handle it. If a person was charged before Pilate and not the Jewish court, then Pilate had to personally question the accused alone to determine if there were grounds for a trial and what we might call a grand jury. So, keeping all that in mind, let's go back to the period of time just before the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem. The Pharisees and the Sadducees had been sending people out to harass Jesus by asking tricky questions that might be the basis for a trial. As the popularity of Jesus grew, the Jewish religious establishment became more and more alarmed with what it considered to be a threat in their way of doing business with the Romans and at the temple. And here's where we have the cleansing of the temple by Jesus, upsetting the tables of the money changers. After Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, that's when the Sanhedrin began meeting privately at night. A meeting was held, and Caiaphas, the high priest, argued that Jesus should be put to death. This was his personal opinion. He didn't say anything about any actual charges, and it should have disqualified him under their law from participating in any legal proceedings against Jesus. And as we see, it didn't. He's going to take the lead in the prosecution. When Jesus entered Jerusalem the week before the Passover, you'll recall that there was quite a bit of public questioning of him by members of the Sanhedrin about his authority to teach. They were also trying to trick him into saying something heretical, treasonous, or both. The ultimate example was, should we give tribute to Caesar? Again, this was done to form a basis for his arrest. You'll recall, at one point, Jesus turned on them and said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites." He knew exactly what they were trying to do. Now, this really got them angry, and they meet again to hammer out the details of his death. That is, the time and manner of the arrest. It was at this time that Judas met with them to discuss the role that he would play in the betrayal of Jesus. On the Thursday of the Passover, Jesus attended what we call the Last Supper in Jerusalem. He went to the Garden of Gethsemane, was betrayed there by Judas, and arrested by the servants of the high priest, or what they called the temple police. Immediately, we see a pattern of legal rules being ignored. First, a violation of procedure was that Jesus was bound, tied up, as if he were a thief, and taken to Annas, a former high priest, who was Caiaphas' father-in-law. Annas tried to get Jesus to admit that he had violated Jewish law. Jesus didn't cooperate. Annas then had a guard strike Jesus in the face, another violation of the rules. It was at this point that Peter was in the process of denying Jesus 3 times. Jesus was then taken to the house of Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin had hastily assembled for his trial. It was then just after midnight on Friday. No one was present to defend him. His only 2 friends on the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, were absent, probably because they feared to defend him openly, or because they refused to participate in what was actually an illegal judicial proceeding. Under Jewish law, the first order of business was to be the arraignment of the prisoner. That is, the reading of the charges against him in open court. And for there to be an arraignment, Jesus would need to have been accused by 2 witnesses, because the Sanhedrin could not originate the charges. 2 witnesses did appear at this arraignment, and one testified that Jesus had said, "I can destroy this temple," while the other swore that he said, "I will destroy this temple," referring to the episode when Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." This testimony was probably offered to show the lawlessness of Jesus in threatening to destroy the temple, the greatest building in Jerusalem. Of course, we know that he was referring to his body as the temple. Even so, the lack of agreement between the witnesses that were heard proved nothing, and their testimony should not have been admitted into evidence. However, the high priest seemed to have regarded their testimony as conclusive, because he called upon Jesus to offer his defense. Jesus was given no opportunity to prepare a defense, having heard the allegations against him. However, a defense should not have been required under the circumstances, because no positive proof of a crime had been offered under Jewish law. At this point, Jesus should have been acquitted by the high priest. Jesus undoubtedly understood this, for he kept silence. As Isaiah prophesied, he did not open his mouth. He was led like a sheep to slaughter. The silence of Jesus infuriated the high priest, who then took on the role not of a judge, but of a prosecutor. And he demanded that Jesus state whether or not he was the Son of God. He had no legal right to ask this question because it might tend to incriminate Jesus. The response of Jesus was merely, "You are saying that I am." And when he says "I am," he says it in a way that only he said it. The Greek expression is ego eimi, which is the divine name of God. So Jesus is saying, you are saying, I'm God. This apparently was the confession that the high priest had sought. With this statement from Jesus, the high priest announced what was essentially a judgment against Jesus by saying, he has spoken blasphemy, and he would have been had he not been God in the flesh. It should be remembered that this first hearing before the Sanhedrin was finished at about 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday, the great feast day of the Passover. The court adjourned until daybreak to take final action against Jesus and to put him to death. Since this was a feast day, it also made that second hearing illegal. At about 6 in the morning on Friday, Jesus was taken into the hall of the temple where the judges of the Sanhedrin had assembled for the second and final hearing. Instead of taking 3 days off, which they were required to do, they only took 3 hours off. No witnesses were examined before the court at this hearing. And the court again violated the law by requiring Jesus to testify against himself by asking, are you the Son of God? To this, Jesus responded, you say that I am, using again the divine name in Greek. Jesus was then again convicted of blasphemy based solely upon this statement. We've been told that the Sanhedrin did not have the power or authority to pronounce or execute a sentence of death. This power was possessed solely by the Roman government. So after Jesus' second hearing, he was bound, tied up, and carried to Pilate. But is this true? Could the Jews not have executed him? They did it on other occasions. In Acts, when Stephen, the first Christian martyr, is stoned to death, we don't see the Sanhedrin asking the Romans for permission to kill him. When James, the brother of John, is beheaded in Acts, we don't see Caiaphas asking Pilate or any Roman for permission to cut his head off. In John's gospel, when the woman who's caught in adultery is brought to him and about to be stoned to death by Jews, we don't see them having the Romans involved in that execution. I believe that the Jews wanted Pilate on board with this execution. They didn't want to take the full responsibility of killing Jesus. They wanted the Romans to be complicit in it. It's interesting to note that when they arrive at Pilate's palace, the members of the Sanhedrin remain outside. They can't go in to his palace because since this was a feast day, they did not want to defile themselves by entering into the house of a Gentile. Imagine the irony of that. They were now trying to kill the Messiah they'd waited hundreds of years to see. And what was on their minds? They didn't want to defile themselves by walking into the house of a Gentile. Pilate then went out to see them and asked them, as required under Roman law, what the accusation was against Jesus. It should be noted that he did not ask them what sentence they had pronounced, and this greatly surprised the members of the Sanhedrin. They had expected Pilate to merely ratify their sentence. So at first the priests sought to evade Pilate's question, but eventually they answered to the effect that they had tried and condemned Jesus, and it was not for Pilate to say whether or not Jesus was guilty, but to merely give the order for his execution. This was, after all, why they were there. They didn't want to tell Pilate the charge against Jesus, since blasphemy was not a crime in Rome. This response was impertinent, and it enraged Pilate. And he told them to take Jesus away and execute the sentence themselves. It sounds like Pilate thought they had the right to execute Jesus. Since they wanted to spread this ownership of the death of Jesus, which is clearly what they sought, they claimed that they were without the power, and they then announced to Pilate that there was a new charge against Jesus involving a violation under Roman law. The Roman law they claimed Jesus had violated was treason against Caesar and inciting rebellion against the government because he had counseled others not to pay their taxes to Caesar, and because he had made the statement, "I am Christ, the King." Since this new charge directly affected the sovereignty of Rome, Pilate entered the judgment hall, which he called the Praetorium, and called Jesus in for a private interview. During this private interview with Jesus, it became clear to Pilate that Jesus used the word king in a sense other than that of an earthly political ruler. Pilate mounted his judgment seat and pronounced his first acquittal of Jesus by saying, "I find no fault in him." Up to this point, the proceedings had been conducted by Pilate in full and absolute conformity with Roman law. From this point on, however, we will see Pilate's conduct deteriorate and become contrary to the Roman system of justice. This acquittal infuriated the Jewish priests. They then brought another new charge against Jesus, stating that he had been teaching sedition, which is another word for treason, throughout all of Judea, beginning in Galilee. Pilate seemed to ignore this new charge. probably because it was essentially the previous charge, rephrased. But he seized upon the idea that if Jesus were a Galilean, then he should be turned over to Herod Antipas, the judicial magistrate and local ruler in Galilee, on the assumption that Herod alone would have jurisdiction to try him. He therefore ordered Jesus to be taken before Herod, despite having just acquitted Jesus. And this account of Jesus before Herod is found only in Luke's gospel. Now, before we get to the hearing before Herod, you should be aware that there was no love lost between Pilate and Herod. There may have been several reasons for their hatred of each other. For example, the natural rivalry between rulers sharing power. But certainly one reason for their hatred occurred just after Pilate had arrived in Judea as the imperial procurator, about 5 or 6 years before this incident with Jesus. Pilate had always been something of a bootlicker or a brown nose, and he thought that he could endear himself to the emperor Tiberius at that time by having standards which were shields with the image of the emperor's face on them placed in the temple in Jerusalem. Of course, these graven images were an abomination to the Jews, and they demanded that they be removed. Pilate told them that he would kill anyone who touched them, and the Jews told Pilate he would have to kill then everyone in Judea. With this standoff going on, members of the Sanhedrin sought help from Herod, who went around Pilate's back and sent word to Tiberius in Rome that his procurator was causing problems and disturbing the peace. Tiberius immediately ordered Pilate to remove the shields from the temple. Imagine how humiliating this was for Pilate, and how much he must have hated Herod for complaining directly to the emperor Tiberius. Herod, as you will remember, had heard of Jesus and had been curious to meet him and talk with him for some time. Herod asked Jesus many questions, to which Jesus offered no reply. Herod eventually became upset with the silence of Jesus, and he took no action on the charge of treason, and simply had Jesus dressed in a white robe, like the one worn by candidates for public office in Rome. He put this toga on Jesus to humiliate him. He then sent him back to Pilate. Since, according to Pilate, Herod had jurisdiction over Jesus, it can only be assumed that under the law, Jesus had again been acquitted for the second time. However, he was dragged back before Pilate, and again, Pilate told the Jews that he had examined Jesus and found no fault in him. Pilate also mentioned that apparently Herod had found nothing wrong with Jesus as well, and therefore he had done nothing that would justify putting him to death. However, Pilate told the Jews that if it would make them happy, he would have Jesus tortured, flogged. Although under Roman law, Pilate had no right to order this. The accused had just been found innocent and acquitted 3 times. Even so, the judgment of punishment by flogging should also have constituted a legal bar to any further proceedings against Jesus. Thus, after the flogging, Jesus should have been entitled to his freedom. He should have been let go. After Jesus was flogged, it was then that the Roman soldiers humiliated him by placing the crown of thorns on his head. Jesus was then brought before the crowd, which had been prompted by the Jewish priests to shout, "Crucify him," upon demand. In disgust, Pilate said, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." Again, apparently Pilate thought they had the right to kill Jesus. But the Jews were not satisfied with this pronouncement because they wanted an absolute judgment against Jesus from Pilate. This would absolve the Jews of any responsibility for the execution of Jesus. They told Pilate that Jesus had called himself the Son of God. Pilate was now really scared, and then took Jesus again into the judgment hall and questioned him further, asking him, "Where have you come from?" If Jesus were a god or a messenger of the gods, Pilate, who was clearly superstitious, didn't want to crucify him. But Jesus made no reply to any of his questions. Jesus presumably knew that if he said anything at all now about heaven or the kingdom of God, Pilate might let him go. Pilate then brought Jesus again before the crowd. And this is what you see in this scene before you, in this picture. Pilate says in Latin, "Ecce homo," behold the man. This infuriated the crowd further, and they cried out that if Jesus were released, Pilate was not a friend of Caesar. The whole account of this proceeding indicates that Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, but he feared the crowd and the Sanhedrin. Therefore, what we have here was a struggle played out in the mind of a weak man between what he knew to be right and his fear of the crowd and the Jewish priests, and criticism, probably, from Rome for his inability to handle the situation. He was undoubtedly afraid that if he released Jesus, complaint about him would reach Tiberius, the emperor. The best you can say about Pilate is that he understood what was right, but he lacked the moral strength to follow through. Even so, Pilate made one more effort to save Jesus, since it was the custom during the feast of the Passover to liberate a prisoner picked by the crowd. Pilate offered Jesus for Barabbas, who had been a thief and a murderer. And he offered him to the crowd, thinking that they would want Jesus released rather than this violent criminal. To his surprise, the mob cried, "Crucify him," when he offered Jesus to them. Pilate then asked, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the people responded, "We have no king but Caesar." This was an especially ironic response given their hatred of Rome. At this point, Pilate gave up and released Barabbas and turned Jesus over to be crucified. And the manner in which he did that was he took a stick and broke it in half and then threw it at the feet of Jesus, making a cross, indicating the kind of execution he would have. And then he publicly washed his hands before the crowd in a basin of water, saying, I am innocent of the guilt of this just person. See you to it. Little did Pilate know that in doing this, he was performing a mysterious rite ordered by Moses. But the Jews who saw Pilate declaring himself innocent must have thought of it. And what that was in Deuteronomy. If an animal that was owned by someone else wandered onto your property and somehow died on your property, then to show your innocence, you would ask all of your neighbors, and especially whoever owned the animal, to come onto your property. And then you would wash your hands in front of them and say, I am innocent of the guilt of the death of this animal. Jesus was thus condemned to die for treason, even though Pilate tried him for it and found him not guilty on 4 separate occasions. Jesus also had been legally acquitted by Herod. He was thus denied every right and privilege under Jewish and Roman law that even the commonest man would have expected to receive. The Sanhedrin was the supreme tribunal of God's chosen people. Roman law governed legal and political rights of the entire Western world. Jesus was thus tried before the most sophisticated laws of God and man. And just to recap what's happened, the arrest of Jesus was illegal. The private examination of Jesus before Annas was illegal. The charges brought against Jesus were illegal in form. The proceedings of the Sanhedrin were illegally held at night and on the day before the Sabbath and the first day of the Passover. The trial of Jesus was illegal because it was concluded in one day. The Sanhedrin's sentence of condemnation against Jesus was illegal because it was based on his uncorroborated confession, and the verdict was unanimous. The Sanhedrin's proceedings against Jesus were illegal because they were not held in the temple, and its members were legally disqualified to try Jesus. What all of this shows is the vast improbability of the conviction of Jesus and his execution under Jewish and Roman law. Had Jesus been anyone other than the Son of God, he most certainly would have been acquitted and released. But because he was born to die for our sins, God used the Sanhedrin and Pilate to accomplish his purpose. And that purpose was the redemption of you and me and the world. Thank you for your attention.